Good morning to many listeners in the United States. Good afternoon to some listeners and at least one participant in Europe. I'm Jane Harmon, the president and CEO of the Wilson Center, and welcome you to this virtual conversation assessing, quote, Europe whole and free, the future of the OSCE. The rhyme was not intentional, but guess what? We did it. Today's event is sponsored by our Global Europe program under the direction of our newly minted director, Dan Hamilton, who will take over managing this program for me in a little while. It's also sponsored by our Kennan Institute in partnership with the U.S. Helsinki Commission. Dan joins the Wilson Center after holding a variety of senior positions in the U.S. Department of State, including notably and relevant to this event, Deputy Assistant Secretary for European Affairs, responsible for NATO, the OSCE, and transatlantic security issues of the Nordic, Baltic, and Balkan affairs. He also retains an affiliation with CSCE, I believe, and taught there for quite a while, Johns Hopkins. Our conversation today marks an important milestone. 30 years ago today, the Charter of Paris for the New Europe was signed by 34 European and North American countries, symbolizing an end to the 40-year division of Europe into two hostile camps. It formally signaled the end of the Cold War and set the OSCE, or the CSCE, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, on the course of becoming the consensus-based security group we now call the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Here at the Wilson Center, we're really good at understanding history and how history shapes policy, and we have a deep connection to the OSCE through our programs like the Kennan Institute and now our Global Europe program, through our former Wilson Center fellows, including Ambassador Wolfgang Ischinger, who is chairman of the Munich Security Conference, where I personally serve on his executive committee, and through, among others, former Helsinki Commission Chief of Staff, Spencer Oliver, who is on this call and will participate later in the program. And frankly, through my role and the role of our first speakers as members of Congress, who remain close to the OSCE, and I must say, call out a former chairman of the Helsinki Commission, good friend of all of ours, Steny Hoyer. Our speakers today will delve into the origins of the group, but also the critical role played by Congress in the development of the principles undermining the Helsinki Final Act in 1975, the Charter of Paris in 1990, and the creation of the OSCE. As I mentioned, having visited the OSCE personally myself, somebody I'd like to recognize who I believe is on this call is Lamberto Zanier, former Secretary General of the OSCE. We are still involved with Lamberto, and he's headlined a number of events at the Wilson Center, so it's very good to see you, my friend. But having said all that good stuff, while 30 years does call for celebration, the OSCE now faces significant challenges. Freedom is still elusive for many Europeans. That's not a secret. The continent is not fully at peace. That's also not a secret. And Europe is again racked by divisions, in part exemplified by the current leadership crisis within the OSCE, about which we'll hear a lot. Looking forward, what are the prospects for a more whole, free, and at peace Europe? What is the future of the OSCE? And what is the role and responsibility of the United States, which will be under new leadership in a very short period of time? To discuss these issues, I am delighted that we will begin with two key members of Congress who can speak to the constructive and bipartisan role that Congress has historically and currently played with respect to the OSCE. To start us off will be my former colleague, Senator Ben Cardin of Maryland, who's in his third term as senator, but prior to that served in the House, where I was, for a number of years, where he represented Maryland's 3rd Congressional District. Ben has spoken at the Wilson Center many times, most recently in 2018 for an event titled Rule of Law, a linchpin of U.S. foreign policy. He's been a commissioner on the U.S. Helsinki Commission since 1993, serving as chairman of the commission in the 111th and 113th Congress. In 2015, he was named special representative on anti-Semitism, racism, and intolerance to the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. Our other speaker is Republican Congressman Robert Aderholt, who represents Alabama's 4th congressional district and has been in Congress since 1997. He's a member of the House Committee on Appropriations, serves as ranking member of the Subcommittee on Commerce, Justice, and Science. He's been a commissioner on the U.S. Helsinki Commission since 2001, and we are thrilled to welcome him to the Wilson Center. So let's start with you, Ben, for 5 to 7 minutes of opening remarks, followed immediately by Congressman Aderholt.
Well, Jane, first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity, and thank you for holding this event. First of all, it gives me a chance to see some of my friends. It's great to have Spencer Oliver on the call, and Robert Aderholt, my colleague from Alabama. The two of us have worked very closely together within the OSCE. And I'll start with that understanding. The OSCE and the U.S. Helsinki Commission has operated in a very nonpartisan, bipartisan way since day one. So it's an area where we come together promoting the principles of Helsinki, and it has brought, I think, us together in the United States Congress with a common mission to advance goals that are important to democratic states. So thank you for holding this event. It's a historic day, the 30th anniversary of the Charter of Paris. But let's go back a little bit in time, if we might, at least to start, to 1975, when the Helsinki Final Act was entered into. It was basically an initiative in which Russia wanted to claim legitimacy as a democratic state. And they were the ones who really wanted to have the Commission for Security and Cooperation in Europe to show to Europe that they were part of the democratic fiber of the continent, even though they were not. And the years between 1975 and 1990 were years of struggle. I'm going to just fast forward a little bit to 1987. 1987 was my first year in the United States Congress. My best friend at that time was Steny Hoyer, who was chair of the U.S. Helsinki Commission. He asked me to get involved with the work of the U.S. Helsinki Commission in 1987. I did. The first issues I got involved with were basically Soviet Jews and trying to save Soviet Jews under the umbrella of the U.S. Helsinki Commission, and remember meeting with representatives of the Soviet Union and talking about these issues. And it was a struggle. I had the opportunity to visit Berlin, a divided city, to see the impact of the Cold War in the division of Europe and recognize that the damage that had been done. Perestroika came in 1987, 88, and 89 with Gorbachev, where he was trying to move towards a more open society. And then in 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Paris came a year later, the second summit of the Helsinki process. And it was a major accomplishment to get to 1990. But the years between 1975 and 1990 were years of struggle. There were years of trying to promote the principles of Helsinki, even though we were very far from reaching those goals. And I want to acknowledge up front the work of the frontline crusaders. And top on that list would be Yuri Orlov, the founder of the Moscow Helsinki Group in 1976. He spent 15 years in prison in Russia as a result of his advocacy on behalf of human rights for the people of Russia. And he found a new home in the United States. He died this past September at the age of 96. But the point I bring up here with mentioning Yuri's name is that the Helsinki process was not just a dialogue among governments, but between governments and their citizens. And we should acknowledge today the importance of civil societies because they're facing renewed repression in the OSCE region. So the Paris Charter was a major accomplishment. It was a major statement, something we can celebrate. In that was the commitment that democracy as the only system of government for our nations. That was the statement of the Paris Charter. Defending the free media from attack, deterring electoral misconduct through our observation missions, and the premier organization in the world defending human rights. And I'll just give you one example, if I might, of that advancement. And that was the progress we made in combating human trafficking, modern day slavery. I say that because that was an initiative that started in the US Helsinki Commission. We took it to the Parliamentary Assembly. It was adopted in the Parliamentary Assembly, and it led to legislation such as Trafficking in Persons Report in the United States Congress, which is the premier document globally on evaluating how well every country is doing in fighting modern day slavery. So one of the great accomplishments of the Charter of Paris was the Parliamentary Assembly, giving a legislative arm to the OSCE. And yes, I do want to acknowledge once again Spencer Oliver, the longtime Secretary General of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. He really went up against the bureaucracies of our government and established the Parliamentary Assembly as an effective voice within the OSCE. We initiated so many of the activities within the OSCE, and we were not restricted as they are in Vienna by the consensus rule. So it's a proud record of accomplishments, but there is still much room for improvement. As we talk about going forward, let's acknowledge that the OSCE needs to be more open in the way it does its business. It has to have greater access to non-governmental organizations. They have an issue of how organizational work is done through consensus. They have to be able to overcome those obstacles. But the principal problem within the OSCE today is not the deficiencies in its organization. It's the lack of commitment by the member states to the principles of Helsinki. The principles of defending human rights of its citizens, the principles of non-interference in sovereignty, territory of member states. So on this 30th anniversary of the Paris Charter, let's remember the key mission: to build, consolidate, and strengthen democracy as the only system of government of our nations. We all know we can do better. And from the point of view of the United States, let me say, we recognize that we have challenges in our own country, and we recognize the Helsinki process, that every state can do better. And we welcome the active participation of other states as to how well we're doing in our own state. But make no mistake about it, we have countries that have done major violation to the principles of Helsinki, from Russia to Belarus to Turkey to Azerbaijan to Hungary. The list goes on and on and on. We are committed to a nonpartisan process to continue the great work that was started in 1975, that was really brought to height in 1990. And we are committed to making sure, as we transition from one administration to another, the bipartisan work we have within the OSCE framework, within the Helsinki process, will only be strengthened to advance the principles of democracy and democratic institutions. And with that, Jane, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you very much, Ben. Congressman Aderholt.
Oh, thank you, Jane. It's good to be with you, and thanks for the invitation to participate this morning, and especially to have an opportunity to be with some of my colleagues from the OSCE. Of course, Senator Cardin, who we just heard from, who has been a mentor to me on the OSCE and has worked alongside him for many years. And then, of course, it's good to see George Ceratelli that's going to be joining us a little bit later. Had the privilege to work with George for several years as a parliamentarian from Georgia. And then, of course, our current Secretary General, Roberto Montello, and the former Spencer Oliver, so Secretary General for the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. So yeah, I get to work with a lot of great people, and of course, not to mention all the staff. I see Alex Johnson here on the call. It's a great organization to work with. But I have had the privilege of working with OSCE for almost 20 years, as you mentioned. I got right after about my third term in Congress, I was able to go and actually Oddly enough, my first OSCE Parliamentary Assembly meeting was in Berlin. And that was my first exposure to it. So it's probably a great place to have this, to have my first meeting and to have to exposure to see. And also it was my first time to Berlin as well. But as we know, and as we've talked about here today, and as Senator Cardin rightly mentioned, it was 30 years ago that the leaders of the participating states of what is now the OSCE did meet in Paris. They did adopt the Charter of a New Europe, which boldly proclaimed democracy as, and let me put this in quotes, the only system of government for our nations. And it also declared, quote, respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms to be irrevocable. And the charter was built upon, of course, the Helsinki Accords that had been signed back in the mid 1970s, which provided the framework for the OSCE as we know it today. It ceased from being an ongoing forum for negotiations and dialogue. And instead, it evolved into a dynamic structure with multiple institutions within the larger body. The participating states extol the role that private citizens and non-governmental organizations have in promoting human rights, promoting democracy, and also the rule of law. I think it's noteworthy in his speech to the summit, then President George H.W. Bush said, "We salute all those individuals in private groups in the West who showed that the protection of human rights is not just business of the government. It is religious leaders and ordinary citizens." And this really remains true today as we witness citizens working to further the cause of freedom. And a lot of times they do this at a lot of personal risk. The OSCE, of course, is widely known of having one of the most comprehensive human rights commitments in the world. And that's no small part and due to the breadth of human rights commitments that was agreed on at this landmark summit in Paris. And I'll be honest with you, when I came in 2001 as a member of the OSCE, what attracted me to the OSCE and to get involved was the involvement with human rights commitments and human rights commitments for people around the world, whether that be in their political freedoms that they had, but also their religious freedoms that they could worship as they choose and would not be persecuted or discriminated because of it. And what the Helsinki Final Act, what it was for the territorial integrity of the states, the Charter of Paris is for fundamental freedoms. The fall of the Berlin Wall, of course, in November of '89, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 really gave the Paris summit its landmark bookends. And after a long, tense decades in the Cold War and really catastrophic fears of nuclear war, really at that point gave way to hopes of a real security, lasting cooperation in Europe, and a post-World War II goal of Europe being whole, free, and at peace finally seemed to be attainable. And as we look back over 30 years, it's not hard to consider the unfulfilled promise of those euphoric days in Paris, or even consider whether the high watermark of the OSCE may have predated the organization's formal creation in 1995. Of course, it goes without saying there are many regions within the OSCE footprint that remains where there is strife, where peace and democracy still hang in the balance. Also compounding these matters, or there's leadership vacuum at the OSCE institution that was envisioned by the Paris Charter to resolve conflicts and restore confidence. But while our predecessors in the Paris meeting, they had very interesting times during their day, the conversations that took place without a pandemic going on. And of course, like we have never seen in our own lifetime. And just as no one participating in that Paris Charter could predict the collapse of the Soviet Union, which at that time was literally only a year away, we cannot yet see the contours of the world that will emerge from the lockdowns that we're seeing now and this disruption that the coronavirus has really brought to the entire world. I think the question will be is, will the post-COVID era be marked by economic resurgence and a spirit of collaboration, by prolonged recession and conflict? Will we get another chance to revitalize the lofty aspirations that's contained in this charter? And whatever the future holds, I believe that a revitalized OSCE will be a powerful asset for our leaders as they navigate in a new era, as we continue to call upon all governments to respect the inalienable rights of the government. So with that, let me just close and say again, thank you for allowing me to participate today and be a part of this. And it's great to be with all of you today.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. I want to introduce the rest of our program and ask you both one question, if I can keep you that long. But let me make an observation first, and that is how refreshing from the vantage point of a weary American it is to see two members of Congress in different parties not only engage their friendship with each other, but the mission that they share of being very good stewards of the OSCE. Let's just
Thank you.
Contemplate that for 1 second. And as many of you on this call knows, I served there with both of them for 9 terms and left in 2011 because the toxic partisanship was just, for me, too hard to take. So I came to the oasis of the Wilson Center, where we are nonpartisan and we try to reflect views from both sides. And the interesting thing is members of both parties choose to appear on our fora. So I'm happy to be where I am, have to say, but I'm very happy you're both where you are. Keep taking your vitamins. Let me mention who else will be on this program. Following one question to both of you and turning this program over to Dan to manage, we will have 2 Europeans. We will have Robert Rydberg, who serves as Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Sweden. He's also the incoming OSCE chair in office. And following him will be, and he's been mentioned, George Ceratelli, who has served as the president of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly since November 2017. Previously, he was vice president of the Assembly, first elected in the 2012 annual session in Monaco and subsequently re-elected during the 2015 annual session in Helsinki. Following them, our dear friend Bob Zelick will be back for one of his enormous number of appearances at Wilson Center events. Bob was the president of the World Bank from 2007 to 2012. He was U.S. Trade Representative from 2001 to 2005, Deputy Secretary of State from 2005 to 2006. But most important for this purpose, from 1985 to 1993, he served as counselor to the Secretary of the Treasury and Jim Baker, and Undersecretary, and he was also Undersecretary of State under Secretary Jim Baker. Jim Baker had virtually every role in government, as Bob did, as well as White House Deputy Chief of Staff. For sure, Bob was in all the rooms where it happened when all of these arrangements were put in place. And he's still a very active chronicler of not just US politics, but all things related to this topic. So I only have one question, and it interests me a lot. And Ben mentioned it more, I think, but you did too, Robert. The OSCE is based on the concept of consensus. How refreshing is that in today's fractured world? One of the things that's so interesting is Russia is a member of the OSCE. However, as I mentioned earlier, and I know we'll discuss, the OSCE is undergoing a leadership crisis. So my question to both of you is that, to quote the former Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, is the concept of consensus quaint? Do we have to get over it and move to some other governing idea for the OSCE?
Well, Jane, it is unique that we have this consensus requirement in every decision made within the OSCE in Vienna. but it's worked over its history. I mean, the proof is that it is still the most effective regional organization in the world. It has a proud record of accomplishments. I would argue also that the bureaucracy in Vienna leads to inefficiencies within the OSCE. There's bureaucracies created in Vienna that have little to do with even the good connections to the capitals. So there are problems in how it operates. We would like to see something short of consensus, particularly when it comes to administrative decisions being made within OSCE, so it could operate more effectively. Because we have seen, as we've seen in the United States Senate, when we try to operate by unanimous consent, one senator can hold up the whole process for a long time. We have the same problem within the OSCE framework. So I think it's time for us to look at ways that we can make the organization more efficient, to have faster decisions made. But I would not try to throw out completely the consensus process. And by the way, the United States has been one of the defenders of consensus, because recognizing, of course, we're across the ocean from Europe, so at times we want to make sure our voice can be heard. But I do think it's time to look at reforms within the OSCE process so that it can operate more efficiently than it does today.
Robert?
Yeah, I would just echo what Ben says. There is and I think one of the key points that he mentions is that historically it has worked overall. And that has been the tradition in Vienna. And I think overall it's been a good plan, and how that it has been carried out. As Ben rightly mentioned, there are probably some things from the bureaucratic level that could be revised in that regard. But I don't see any reason for the overall process, and especially for those here in the United States, that we should go ahead and discard this consensus concept.
Okay, well, thank you both. Before turning this over to Dan and the rest of all this, let me just mention that we will have a panel at the end following a few questions for Bob Zelick. And that panel will include Spencer Oliver, who's already been recognized, Ambassador Bill Hill, who was a Wilson Center Global Fellow who served 2 terms from January 2003 to 2006 and June 1999 to 2001 as head of the OSCE mission to Moldova. And finally, Alex Johnson, who serves as Chief of Staff of the U.S. Helsinki Commission for the 116th Congress. And prior to that, he served from 2007 to 2015 as a policy advisor to the Commission. So thank you both to members of Congress. Please keep working together. Please make us proud, and please keep coming back to the Wilson Center.
And Jane, we will definitely do that. And let me also welcome our European friends who are on this call. We really appreciate their extraordinary friendship and leadership during this period of time.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Robert. Over to you, Dan.
Thank you. Thank you to the members of Congress and the Helsinki Commission who are participating with us, and to all the speakers. Let's turn right away, as Jane has already introduced them, to our European colleagues. Minister Rydberg, could you join us now for your brief remarks?
Yes, thank you. Senator Cardin, Congressman Aderholt, dear friends, thank you first of all very much for this invitation to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Charter of Paris for a New Europe, a true milestone in European security cooperation and a centerpiece of European security order. It gives me great pleasure to celebrate together with the Woodrow Wilson Center and the Helsinki Commission that over the years have been such a strong voice in support of human rights and democracy in Europe. Your engagement is a clear example of the value of the transatlantic link, which is essential for the security in Europe, in defense of our common values of democracy and human rights, and for cooperation on military and other security matters. Looking back 30 years, when the Charter of Paris was adopted, there was a strong sense of hope. We saw an opportunity to build international cooperation based on respect for democracy and human rights for everyone in Europe. After decades of communist and Soviet rule, millions of people in Europe were finally getting the freedom to choose their political leaders, and states were given the opportunity to independently decide if or which security arrangements they wanted to belong to. When Swedish Foreign Minister Ann Linde takes on the role of chairperson of the OSCE in a month and a half, 28 years will have passed since we, Sweden, last held that office. Today's political landscape could not be more different from that of the early 90s. Today, when democracy and fundamental rights are being systematically challenged, also within the OSCE region, it's hard to believe that back then the end of history was predicted and the spread of liberal democracy was seen as unstoppable. That said, developments over the past 3 decades show that given the chance, peoples and states choose freedom over tyranny and cooperation over conflict. The European Security Order, with the Helsinki Final Act and the Paris Charter at the center, provide the framework for achieving this. It is no coincidence that nearly all serious challenges to our security stem from situations where the fundamental principles of Helsinki and Paris are not respected, be it violations of Ukraine's territorial integrity or the lack of respect for democracy and human rights that has led to the protests in Belarus this autumn. The OSCE has the means to support participating states to live up to their commitments from Helsinki and Paris. We have tools to specifically address different phases of the conflict cycle in our region. The OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine is one such tool. The offer by Chairman in Office Rama and Foreign Minister Linde to facilitate a genuine dialogue in Belarus is another example. But without genuine political will from those involved in conflicts, progress is of course hard to reach. This is why defending the European Security Order and its fundamental principles will be a priority for the Swedish 2021 chairpersonship of the OSCE. We see it as essential to build on principles agreed by all in order to achieve security for all. In short, we want to go back to basics. 2 other priorities for our chairpersonship is to strengthen the comprehensive concept of security and to contribute to solving the conflicts in our region. They are in many ways part and parcel of our commitment to the security order. The priorities are interlinked, as there can be no sustainable security without equality between women and men, respect for democratic norms, and the universal enjoyment of human rights. One of the first activities we are planning for next year is an expert-level meeting on anti-Semitism in Vienna in the beginning of February. This meeting, where the chair's personal representative on combating anti-Semitism, Rabbi Baker, will have a leading role, could also provide useful input to the Malmö Forum on Holocaust Remembrance and Combating Anti-Semitism, which will be hosted by Prime Minister Stefan Löfven in September 2021. In conclusion, dear friends, we believe that through dialogue, inclusion, and respect for agreed principles, the OSCE can make a real difference. And the Charter of Paris is essential for the OSCE. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. That was great remarks. We appreciate it very much. Let me turn right away now to President Ceratelli. I also want to just shout out to Roberto Montella, who's with us, the Secretary General of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. But I turn to President Ceratelli, please.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you very much, Ms. Herman, for this invitation. I'm very much pleased to take part in this important discussion with this distinguished participants. I'd like to welcome some of our old friends, and I'm very happy to see here Spencer Oliver, who is one of the main founders of the OSCE, and especially the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. We're always underlining his very, very special role. And of course, leaders of our assembly, current and previous, our good friends, Senator Cardin, Robert Aderholt. We just concluded a few minutes ago online event that marked the 30th anniversary of the Charter of Paris, and Ben Cardin also delivered his remarks there. So we all agree that this visionary document, which during the incredible upheavals of the early 90s includes some of the strongest and very clear principles adopted by the OSCE participating states. And it tasked us with working together towards the fulfillment of universal aspirations of men and women throughout the OSCE region, and democracy based on human rights and freedoms, prosperity through economic liberty and social justice, and equal security for all of our countries. The United States, in particular, through the active engagement of members of Congress and Helsinki Commission, has tried to live up to that vision by reinforcing political and military dialogue across the OSCE region. It has been an essential supporter of democracy, rule of law, and a greater respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Overall, American engagement has strengthened security and promoted stability throughout the OSCE area. But despite the enthusiasm and optimism of 90s and 1990 exactly, we should remember that the leaders who signed the document were fully aware of the challenges lying ahead. They knew that eliminating the threat of major war did not rule out the possibility of conflict in Europe. Just to quote US President George Bush at the time, as old political divisions disappear, other sources of tension, some ancient, some new, are emerging. National disputes persist and abuses of minority and human rights continue. 30 years later, geopolitical confrontation remains commonplace. As we have seen most recently in Nagorno-Karabakh, but also in Ukraine and Georgia, armed conflict remains a formidable challenge. There is uneven progress in implementation of OSCE commitments, in particular in the human dimension. And in this exceptional year, we have seen the disruptive powers of international and transnational challenges. As our countries and populations continue to battle the COVID-19 pandemic, we still need to protect our citizens against the threat of violent extremism and terrorism, find ways to safely manage migrant and refugee flows, and urgently address the threat of climate change. All this should lead us today to reflect in depth on the history and role of our organization. Given the current leadership crisis was mentioned also in previous intervention in the OSCE executive structures, which is a byproduct of a gradual breakdown in trust and dialogue between OSCE participant states. We must urgently find ways to reinvigorate the organization and promote effective multilateral cooperation. Having been member of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly for over a decade, I remain convinced that we must continue to fully exploit the potential of parliamentary diplomacy, as outlined in the Charter of Paris, as an inclusive and constructive tool to break political deadlock. As we have done in the past, we must remain outspoken in our commitment for more transparency and accountability within the OSCE as a way to make the organization stronger and more effective. And in order to consolidate the achievements of the OSCE over the last 3 decades, we parliamentarians have an important job to do. I know that the members of the Helsinki Commission are fully committed to this endeavor. Their support lends considerable weight to our work, and we are very much thankful for this. Through events such as this one, or participation in our meetings and missions in the field, they help significantly raise the visibility of the entire organization. And they continue to give and call for high-level political attention to the work of the OSCE, which is crucial, through debates in Congress and a joint work with the State Department and other parts of the administration. And this serves as an inspiration for more OSCE countries to hold their governments accountable and push for the full implementation of the OSCE commitments. So as a word of conclusion, let me again thank the Helsinki Commission, Senator Cardin, Congressman Aderholt, and others. I see here Alex Johnson, who is a great supporter of work of OSCE Parliamentary Assembly and all this stuff. And thanks for carrying this important work on behalf of all our countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We appreciate those words. Given the time and I know people's constraints, I'm going to turn now directly to Bob Zelick. Jane has already introduced Bob, who's literally one of those people you don't need to introduce. But I think the point that Jane made at the end of her introduction, Bob, that time, 1990, 89, 90, was a time where a lot of puzzle pieces had to be put together. And you were the one, really, frankly, who were in a lot of those rooms where those pieces had to be sorted out. So I just wonder if you have reflections on that time, but also about the future, and over to you.
Well, thanks, Dan. And it's a privilege to be with Senator Cardin and Congressman Aderholt and the President and Minister, and of course, my longtime friend, Jane Harman. In particular, I want to thank both Jane and also the members of Congress. I totally agree with her. I think, not only do I want to thank you for your tireless work for U.S. internationalism, but as I've seen over the decades, if there are ways that Democrats and Republicans can at least work together on some items and see each other across the aisle, it makes a huge difference in getting things done. So I really compliment both of you in particular. So I want to offer just a quick word on the past and an observation for today. So the Charter of Paris was the culmination of 2 years of intensive diplomacy to bring the 40-year-old Cold War to a peaceful end. Now, to put this in a larger historical context, you could compare it with the Congress of Vienna in 1815 after the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars, or the Paris Peace Conference after 1919 and World War I, because Europe had never settled the issues after the end of World War II in 1945. We had the long delay of the Cold War. And just consider the strategic context in 1989-91. We were unifying a democratic Germany while trying to reassure neighbors east and west of future security. And many people forget the critical determination that Gorbachev made on accepting a united Germany and NATO was based on the CSCE principle that countries would be free to choose their alliance. It's the point that President Bush made in June of 90 and Gorbachev accepted. We also wanted to create an opportunity for the countries of Central and Eastern Europe to move beyond that place in history that had often been referred to as the lands between Germany and Russia, become part of a unified democratic Europe. Also to reassure security from the Atlantic to the Urals with a landmark conventional forces agreement, which had huge reduction in troops, transparency, verification, often overlooked by historians, but quite important. To assist the Soviet Union, later Russia, the former Soviet Union, to its transition, an end of its empire, while respecting its concerns for security, development, and political ties. Supporting the EC's transition into what is today the European Union with political and monetary union, while encouraging the EC to expand to the East and have ties with the United States. And as Jane mentioned from the start, recognizing the transatlantic connection with the US and Canada, in part through changes in NATO and also the institutionalization of CSCE as OSCE. So as Senator Cardin mentioned, this history is important. The United States had recognized CSCE's roles in the last 15 years of the Cold War in trying to encourage human rights, more open societies, serving as a rallying point for courageous dissidents. As Congressman Aderholt mentioned, engaging civil society in formal diplomacy. In December of 1989, so this is right after the wall came down, Secretary Baker gave a speech in Berlin that outlined the path for German unification, but it was done so in the context of necessary changes in Europe, in NATO, in US-EC relationship, and in the CSCE. And at that time, we envisioned that CSCE could be an umbrella body to help build the institutions of democracy. So we were just feeling our way, but there were ideas of election monitoring, critical role of parliamentary assembly, because as we've seen even today, the legislators of all these countries will be the fundamental political and public support. The principles of economic freedom, forum for negotiating security disputes, a link to the civil society, and importantly, from the US perspective, to reinforce the strong interest of Congress, because nothing lasts long in US policy unless you've got congressional support. But even as the countries were signing the Charter of Paris, the old ghosts of Europe were reawakening in the Balkans. Soviet Union was on the verge of breakdown. And I think this is a caution not only for then, but for today, which is the work of diplomacy and democracy is never done. It's an ongoing mission. So today, the ties between the United States and Europe have frayed. We actually have the United Kingdom leaving the European Union. Yet in facing the fundamental questions of the future of free societies, I think the European Union, the US, the other non-European Union members in Europe, the United Kingdom, we all have a tremendous amount in common. My own sense is that President Biden is going to face a very demanding domestic agenda, pandemic, inclusive economic recovery, future biological security, climate change, immigration, racial tensions. But a creative policy could actually connect each of these with an international agenda, and in doing so, rebuild ties with allies and partners. I mean, just to take an example, if next year is a year, I hope, of vaccines and medical treatments, well, it's not enough to frankly rejoin the WHO. You're also going to have to extend its role, which you can do with some of the international financial institutions like the World Bank, to the developing countries. Or as President Bush 43 launched an HIV/AIDS initiative with the help of Congress, which was a game changer for sub-Saharan Africa. We're also seeing that these virus breakouts are becoming more frequent, greater economic costs because of changes in the wildlife, livestock, human connection. So there'll be a need for preventive action. In carbon, I believe it's important for the US to join the Paris Accord, but one will have to go beyond that. This is ultimately will be a challenge for the biggest economies in the world. If you can get 10 or 12 of them to really focus, you're going to make a huge difference. But you also have ways to bring in the developing countries. When I was at the World Bank, we explored how soil carbon could be great for absorbing carbon and helping African agriculture, forestation and avoided deforestation, adaptation, particularly for island states, and the need to work with the European Union on cybersecurity, data, IT issues, both for a sense of our security in the world, but also for some fundamental issues of privacy and human rights. Can we come up with a framework on this that respects national differences while also dealing with the fundamentals? And then there's also all this work can be the foundation for the ongoing dangers, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, Russian revanchism. I personally think that this cooperation could provide the basis for the largest challenge, which is dealing with the rise of China. Because while we're celebrating the events in Europe of 1989-90, it's important to recognize that that's when the Cold War ended. It ended in Europe. It didn't necessarily end in Asia. 1989 was the year of Tiananmen Square. So 30 years on, I think US, Europe, and partners around the world will still need an active diplomacy, critical from the support of Congress. And historically, my sense is Americans have always seen nationalism and internationalism as two sides of the same coin, not necessarily at all in conflict. And I think the challenge for President Biden, supporters in Congress, Americans in general, will be how can we make that work, including through institutions like the OSCE. So thank you for all your efforts.
Thank you so much, Bob. I know you have a few minutes. Let me engage on that. Jane might want to come back in. Jane, do you have a question already? You want to add a comment, or should I proceed?
Why don't you proceed? I have a question, but you go first.
Okay, well, Bob, I think, the context is at the time of all of this happened, the US was what I would call a European power. It was comprehensively, as you even said, engaged in all of the different pieces of that puzzle, and was active in helping the Europeans with all the coalitions they were putting together. We were a source of reassurance for many through a huge transition. It's important to remember, I think, that we had to manage the collapse of two empires simultaneously, the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. One we did relatively well, the other one not so well, and that's the Balkans. And tomorrow is the signing, the 25th anniversary of the Dayton Peace Accord signing.
Mm.
But all of this has changed the context. If we reflect, I would argue the US seems to be drifting away from being a European power to just a power in Europe, more selectively engaged, less comprehensively engaged. Do you think there's a trend there that we need to be watching out for that goes beyond any particular administration? Or do you think a case could be made for the US having to play just as powerful a role as it did in the past?
Well, it's interesting, Dan, you know, Henry Kissinger at, I don't know, I guess 97, 98 now, still has some very wise observations. And he's made a point that he's a concern that will Europe develop a strategic perspective, or will it just become a peripheral part of Eurasia? And, you know, he's not saying that in a critical way. What he's suggesting, and it's certainly been my experience, is though while now and then it's a challenge for North Americans to deal with European politics, the ultimate result is better if Europe can step up and play a role. And so I think the debate that you're seeing right now within Europe about the future of the European Union, I took part in a session just yesterday with European Commission and parliamentary people about trying to look beyond today to kind of their own strategic outlook. I think that's healthy. I think the United States should encourage that. And while I certainly wouldn't have taken the Trump administration's approach, you know, some of the shock effect of Trump has perhaps prodded Europeans to realize the responsibilities they'll have to assume, and maybe that can be constructive. Having said that, I think in the bigger picture, as I tried to suggest with my remarks, if you think about the real challenges facing the world, whether these transnational issues, whether it's the future of free societies, whether it's China, the United States, and I would always look at this as actually from a North American concept with Canada, Mexico, as well as the US, but our most natural partner will be the European Union and Britain. And so in the larger scheme of things, I think it's going to be very important that you're not going to get total agreement, but to recognize the fundamentals of which the OSCE is a wonderful sort of bedrock representative, because those are going to be the big issues that determine the 21st century. And my own guess, Jane may have a better sense of this that I've had, or Ben, but I think the Biden administration is going to take this approach. I mean, and the challenge, of course, is expectations could become so high, they're going to be sort of hard to reach. But I suspect on issues that are on the domestic agenda, pandemic, economic and immigration issues for us, with Central America, for Europe, with Africa and the Middle East, with climate change issues, these will offer possibilities to leverage the domestic agenda internationally. And this isn't to ignore the traditional agenda, it's to complement it. But I'd said on a different call last night with Bob Gates, you know, when we've lost 240 or 250,000 people to COVID, which is more than we've lost in Korea, Vietnam, and World War I combined, I think we got to consider that a security issue.
Right, Jane?
You know, Bob, your optimism is contagious. It's lovely, and you've seen a lot, done a lot so far. I'm not writing you off. I'll never write you off. And by the way, Dan, let me suggest, I'll ask a brief question. I see Ben is still on the call. He might have one too, if Ben would like to do that. And then we'll stay on time. I promise. But my question, Bob, is that, you know, I was in Ukraine in 2015. I was an observer of the election on a delegation led by Madeleine Albright. At the same time, the OSCE had a mission there. Wolfgang Ischinger was setting up roundtables around the country trying to broker participation and inclusion. And while this was all going on, the Russians were meddling in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass. Is there, optimist Bob, is there really hope that the US and Russia and Europe can coexist in this organization called the OSCE and maybe even rebuild some sense of cooperation?
Well, Jane, I'm both a realist and idealist. You're going to have to coexist. I mean, there's simply something called geography, which means that Russia's going to be in the neighborhood. I don't turn a blind eye. Frankly, the issue that I think is most important there is the question of interference in elections and cybersecurity. To me, that was a fundamental national security issue that neither the Obama administration or the Trump administration acted forcefully on. But can you find sort of workable arrangements, as you're trying to sort of build foundations for the future? I hope so. I mean, I think one has to take this, sort of step by step, not starry-eyed. In the case of Ukraine, look, Ukraine's future is going to be determined fundamentally by Ukrainians. And what I mean by that is the political system dealing with corruption, economics. And here again, we need to broaden our concept of security. There's ways that US and Europe can help. There's ways the international financial institutions can help. Ultimately, it still has to be done by the people of these countries. My own sense is that the Russian behavior with Ukraine probably enhanced Ukrainian nationalism more than sort of any other step. But ultimately, it will be up to the Ukrainians. But what I've seen, whether I was in government or the World Bank or outside, is there's a combination of moral support, sharing experience, encouragement that people can often underestimate. But this is where, again, I can't emphasize enough the role of Congress and parliamentary assemblies. I mean, all of you have had to deal with domestic politics, but you're also dealing on the international scene. You have to go home to your voters. You have to deal with issues at home, but you can also help people understand how they can do these things. And, a lot of the end of the day, whether it's a situation in Ukraine, we have a new president in Moldova who actually used to be someone at the World Bank. These are step-by-step actions. And frankly, I'll just come back to the basics that the US, European Union, and the UK will have to be critical players if we want this sort of free society system to continue to not only survive, but I hope to expand.
Let me, since Senator Cardin and Congressman are still here, if I could just ask them briefly just to comment on what they've heard, but also just to push a little bit. I think everyone has made a strong point about the core principles of Helsinki, the Charter of Paris, are still viable. A few of you referenced, though, another major effort Helsinki and the OSCE has done, which is the framework for conventional arms control in Europe. It was the greatest demilitarization of the continent, and it was under the auspices, all sorts of different agreements. And those pillars have eroded. The Open Skies Treaty, the CFE Treaty, the Vienna document, which is about confidence building, those have all eroded. Is there a case to be made, despite the differences with Russia that have been mentioned, to push that again, to see what can be done so we don't have accidents, miscalculations, militaries bumping into each other again? Senator, do you have a comment on that, maybe Congressman?
I do, and let me just follow up on Bob Zelick. What I always enjoyed with my meetings with Bob Zelick is that he really engaged both Democrats and Republicans and listened to us in order to try to get things done. And I think you're going to find the same thing under a Biden administration, that he's going to reach out to both Democrats and Republicans. Bob Zelick recognized that we could advance American values by working on the global scene. And I think Joe Biden shares those same values. He recognizes that US involvement globally is going to be in the United States' interests. So what you're going to see in a Biden administration, I believe you're going to see a president that will embrace those allies that share our values, but he'll engage all of the countries, but it'll be anchored in our values, which, by the way, are the Helsinki Final Act values and reinforced in the Charter of Paris. So that's where I think you're going to see the engagement. So when you talk specifically about arms control and the fact that New START expires at the end of this year, and we could be left with a situation with no major arms agreements with Russia, that's a frightening thought. I think you're going to find that he will engage Russia. It will be based upon our values, the Helsinki Final Act values, and that there will be working with our allies to reinforce our strength in those discussions with Russia. So yes, I am optimistic that we'll see progress made on the global scene. Maybe because, and I'll just give you my editorial comment here, that the Trump administration has been so extreme in its failure to engage in the global community, particularly with our allies, that I think you'll see a rebalance in American foreign policy, which will work to the benefit of security and cooperation between Europe and the United States.
Thank you. Congressman, do you have a comment?
Oh, let me just say it's encouraging to hear Senator Cardin from his the aspect that that Biden will work with both parties. I mean,
Yeah.
the difference that we have seen in past times, and I think we've seen now, is our nation is very divided. And I think it's more so divided than we've seen. You know, we go back to the 2000 election and between Bush and Gore, and it indeed was very, very divided then. But I even think it's even a different level today. And so I think it's going to take somebody to come in there to want to work with both parties, listen to both parties, and really make them feel, as Ben Cardin says about Bob Zelick, that they are listening. And whether that be on domestic issues, and certainly whether that be on international issues, and to respect those positions that have been in the past. So it's encouraging to hear. You know, I have not had a chance like Ben has, and even Jane has, to work with Biden. But I, of course, I've talked with him before, and found him very engaging, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. And I certainly hope that's a signal for things to come.
Thank you so much. I know a number of you have to leave now, so I want to thank you for participating in this conversation, and we encourage you to continue if you can, but I realize the constraints on people's time. And thank you again for joining us. What we'd like to do is just continue the conversation, but now bring in a number of other voices who have also had great experience with the OSCE. Jane has introduced them already, Ambassador William Hill, Spencer Oliver, and Alex Johnson. Each from their own vantage point have a very deep engagement with the organization. And if we think about these broader political comments, some of it does come back to the organization itself. What is the future of the OSCE per se? And so I'm sure you've accumulated comments now. And if George can stay with us, George Ceratelli, if you want to come back in the conversation, having heard now some other things. But let me try to move us a bit, push you all a bit to think about future. We talked about the core frame of this building security within societies as critical to the OSCE. I think there's agreement on that. We've discussed this whole potential of coming back to the arms control framework, which was a major accomplishment of the umbrella of the organization as well, but now is sort of in tatters. But let me just challenge you to think about something else, and I want to shout out to an important mentor of mine, John Kornblum, who was our ambassador also to the OSCE and played a major role in a lot of the transitions that happened to get the organization to where it is. And he and I discussed a lot about future, what are the deeper trends going on. I want to shout out also to Helen Kornblum. I think it might be on the call because she is a monitor. She is an election monitor, volunteer for the OSCE. She's been very engaged. And that's exactly the kind of thing the OSCE does, have people like Helen who go out, in the field and do this type of work. But if you think about the origin of why Helsinki came about in 1975, it was because the East and West were stuck. We were not being able to manage the confrontation, the differences in any way that was useful. And that's why the Helsinki Accord, in essence, if you want to boil it down, was not among countries that agreed on much. It was an agreement on principles that would guide their disagreements, how to guide their behavior as they disagreed on things. It was a common platform, but it was nations of uncommon cause, not nations of common cause. And I wonder today whether one couldn't make a similar case that what we're facing are some very deep changes in the nature of security, driven by all sorts of innovative changes that challenges sort of even the territorial notion of security. It is about the digital revolution. It's changing the connections and thinking about how societies are connected, and disruptions to those links are as much security as thinking about tank armies and territorial security. That sort of connection of security within societies is what the OSCE has done best. So shouldn't there sort of be a new type of discussion of basic principles on issues guiding this new digital transformation we're going through? I don't see it happening anywhere else. Maybe that's something that can happen. So let me just put that thought out to you. But I welcome any comments you might have. Spencer, can I go start with you briefly? Realizing we have 25 minutes and 4 people now to speak, and we'll go back. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's interesting to listen and to know that so many old friends and colleagues are on this call. And particularly want to shout out to John and Helen Kornblum, who I've known for a long time. John and I used to cross swords in the initial days of the creation of the Helsinki Commission. And the Helsinki Commission has played an enormous role in the development of the OSCE, the CSCE, and the OSCE. And still today is one of the best functioning and most important institutions in itself in the OSCE. But the OSCE is in trouble. I mean, and I think that's one of the purposes of this discussion. Part of the reason is it's dysfunctional. And the consensus rule, which, as people know, I've harped against for a long time, not to completely abolish the consensus rule, because I think it's necessary at the highest levels for governments to participate, and to participate in order to protect their own national interest and their own security interest. But when you have the consensus rule applied to the approval of staff and budgets, it has brought about an abuse of the system in such a way that that's the reason that there are no heads of any institutions, because it has been used in a way to find employment for people in Vienna or elsewhere, and not really taking into account the need for the political level engagement of the OSCE. The Charter of Paris and Helsinki Final Act are great documents, and if everybody adhered to them, the world would be a much better place. We could probably never negotiate them again, probably never get agreement on some of the things that are in there, particularly in human rights. But I think that people need to think about what they need to do to in some way unlock the bureaucratic strangle on the OSCE, because people complain. I know Lamberto Zanier has drafted a very interesting manifesto, which I signed on to, about what needs to be done in the OSCE to improve it. But the main thing that needs to happen is we need to have if you want to have political level people at the top of the OSCE and participating at the political level, you have to be able to function like a political organization, not a bureaucracy that is deadlocked because of the consensus rule over minor items like personnel and budget. And that's one of the things that needs to be addressed, I think, in order to move forward. I think everybody needs to recommit to, and has to on several occasions, recommitted to all the provisions of the Helsinki Final Act and the Charter of Paris. But the dysfunction is really in the administration side of the OSCE, and that's something that needs to be addressed. I could go on for a long time about some of these issues, but I won't. But I commend you for bringing together this very distinguished group of people. I recognize a lot of old friends and colleagues from days in which I was engaged with both the Helsinki Commission and the Parliamentary Assembly. So thank you very much for including me.
Spencer. Alex, can I just turn to you, because it's sort of a direct, you're in the current position where you're balancing the U.S. Issues with the Congress and the OSCE, and some of these issues of budget, administrative structure, and the political nature of the organization all come together. I just wonder if you have reflections on that and how you have to manage all of that, and the tension. There's a tension, there between being effective being a platform for dialogue, but also being a platform for accountability. And I wonder how you think about that.
Thank you so much, Dan. And it's such an honor to join so many folks who mentored me over the years in terms of my own knowledge and engagement in the OSCE. First, I wanted to offer greetings from Chairman Hastings of the Helsinki Commission, who, as you all know, was once president of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly and worked closely with many of you, and he extends his regards to everyone. Before I get to the functionality point that you asked about, Dan, I wanted to quickly mention that right now, and I think a perspective I can offer here is that one of a young person who watched the wall fall and who's a part of a generation that among which there are a number of people who are currently willing to accept the economic leverage and of political leaders and others who are trending autocratic right now. This, of course, lends itself to Spencer's point that many of the commitments and principles established in the parish charter, we would not be able to negotiate them today. And additionally, as Senator Cardin mentioned, the biggest problem is non-compliance with those commitments. We are seeing so many challenges in terms of trend lines that all the colleagues here have previously mentioned, and we need to really go about the process of finding mechanisms and solutions to allow for the operations of the OSCE to manage faithfully and continue, and then have the political determinations, of course, operate in that same fashion. The Commission has done its part in terms of convening hearings, briefings, and even taking a look at this unique year of the pandemic to reflect on human rights at home. So Chairman Hastings set forth and worked with partners on the Commission to convene a series of hearings that reflected not only on this global movement around racial justice, but a number of other questions about how the United States was looking at media freedom or other questions. So it's very important that we ourselves as a nation try to adhere to those commitments and then build that dialogue and continue to move forward together as participating states.
Thank you. Bill, Ambassador Hill, you had so much experience with the organization, but I know you're thinking about the future too and ways to keep it relevant. So can you take us to the future? How do we make the OSCE continue to be relevant given the dysfunction that's been mentioned, the political tensions that we're facing? What is its role really?
Well, thanks, Dan, and thanks to the Wilson Center for having me on. And it's great to join so many people with whom I've worked, for whom I've worked. I worked in the CSCE during the times of great disagreement, starting in the mid-1980s, early 1980s, and through the good times of cooperation, and then watched harder times come again. And I find agreement with much has been said, with what Bob Zelick has said about the history. Spencer and Alex, I've been making very good points about how you manage the institution. But the point is that in 1975, when the final act was signed, in 1990, when the Paris Charter and the Treaty on Conventional Forces in Europe was signed, the CSCE, the future OSCE, was dealing with key questions of security, both military, political, and human security in all of Europe or the Euro-Atlantic area. And I know from having over 30 years of experience of trying to call the attention of senior policymakers to the importance of work in an institution, if the institution does not offer the opportunity and the ability to address important questions, the policymakers will be called elsewhere. Their time is limited, and if the participating states bring only what are viewed as peripheral issues to the institution itself will be viewed as peripheral. I think the current crisis in Europe, in North America, the pandemic, and the ongoing uncertainty, the collapse of the post-Cold War era after the Russian annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass offers an opportunity and a necessity to rethink European Euro-Atlantic security.
why is Europe important to us? It still is. Asia's become more important, but Europe is still our main partner. And it's important what sort of system governs Europe and how all European nations deal with their own security. And new issues have arisen. And the OSCE is really the only body in which you can get an all-European, all-Euro-Atlantic solution to these. You can't do it in the EU. There are important nations left out. You can't do it in NATO. There are important nations left out of NATO. You can't do it in the NATO-Russia-Czech council because there are still important countries that don't take part in that. So the OSCE really is the European forum, all European, Euro-Atlantic forum, in which you will deal with questions of how do you adjust a new system? How do you develop a new system of political and military security that takes into account technical advances in the military and the change in the geopolitical landscape in Europe? And we're going to have some tough conversations when we deal with this, because there are nations there that have very different views from us. Russia, certainly, but the issue of Turkey and its relations with its neighbors right now, this is a serious question. These are issues that are going to have to be, and can really only be productively taken up if you include everybody and bring these important, you have to bring the important issues to the table, we as the United States, and you also have to listen to the other countries who bring in questions that at first we're going to be reluctant to entertain. We're not going to be receptive initially to their point of view, but it's in that dialogue, as started in Geneva in 1973, that you eventually get agreement on a broad set of principles and practical arrangements that might take us into a new order. The post-Cold War order that was structured at the Charter of Paris worked well for 25, 30 years. The principles remain and we will still aspire to them, but it's time to negotiate a new order. And I think that's the opportunity for the OSCE if our political leaders are willing to take it. And with a new administration coming in the US, lessons learned from the pandemic, I think it's an ideal time to seize that opportunity.
Thank you, Bill. We have limited time and I don't want to neglect our audience, but apologies to the audience. If you have a question, I can try to weave it in. You would need to send a question to my email, dan.hamilton@wilsoncenter.org. dan.hamilton@wilsoncenter.org. For any question, I'll try to weave in, but I'll continue the conversation as we go ahead. I don't want to pick on Roberto, but I see that he's here. So I want to, Roberto, if you're able, you've been listening patiently. I know you're in the middle of all this, the Secretary General of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. They today also did a major event, I know. And Roberto, you're really in all of this. What do you make of this? What's the future? Because it's your job on the line.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you to the Wilson Center. In a conversation which features my current boss, George Ceratelli, and my former boss and mentor, Spencer Oliver, everything would call for me to sit in religious silence and take notes and listen. But as you call on me to say a few words, I will take—
It's a private event. You're free to speak.
Thank you very much. With George Ceratelli and Spencer Oliver's permission, again, I said I should only sit in religious silence and learn. But you're giving me the opportunity to say that I think this conversation, the informality of it allows me to say that what Spencer just mentioned, the critical issues that are in the organization is very much on target. Indeed, Spencer mentioned the fact that there is a difficulty with the misuse of the consensus rule in the organization, especially when you come to the issues of appointment of leadership of the organization, administrative decisions. Since I have been Secretary General, I must say I have encountered two leadership crises. In 2017, during our annual session in Minsk, I had 4 empty chairs, witnessing the fact that the organization could not find consensus on the leadership of the organization. And now again, since July 17, we do not have leaders in the 4 main top jobs of the organization. When I was confronted with this second leadership crisis, I thought, what can the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly do? I think the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly has learned from Spencer and from other leaders in the past that one of the challenges of this organization is the lack of political attention. I think, and I've been privileged, thanks to Spencer taking me to many ministerial councils before, to talk to ministers during the ministerial meeting. And I've noticed in the ministers sometimes a lack of understanding of where they were. You know, normally the ministerial meeting of the OSCE takes place in between a NATO summit and the following week there is a EU Council meeting. So you would have their ministers who come to the OSCE meeting, read a statement prepared by the ambassadors, and then engage in bilateral meetings that have very little to do with the matters that are dealt with within the OSCE. And therefore, the OSCE game, let's say, is very much left onto those who are in Vienna, the ambassadors, some capitals, but there is very little attention from the political leadership. And I thought the Parliamentary Assembly, who has a plethora of 323 members of parliament who are political leaders in their countries, they have influence in their own national assemblies and in their leadership, they should get engaged and they should step up, especially in this moment when there is a lack of leadership in the OSCE. That's what we did since the OSCE leadership crisis. Our members have started to be speaking up more, have been trying to engage their ministers. And I think we've done a great job in getting our members to engage on all the dossiers of the OSCE. We couldn't have our annual session this year. We couldn't have our normal fora where the parliamentarians engage on the 3 dimensions of the OSCE, but we did a series of parliamentary dialogues on all the issues that are now very much at the center of this pandemic crisis. And all of this resulted into a contribution that we have distributed to the ministers. But what we want to do with this operation, I called it Operation Lazarus. The former Secretary General Spencer Oliver mentioned the manifesto. It's more a call for action for a common endeavor of all the OSCE family. I call this an Operation Lazarus from the idea that something is not so reinvigorated and needs to be reinvigorated. And what we want to do is to engage and get the attention of ministers on what they signed on many years ago. Spencer said that none of the things that we are now having at the acquis of the OSCE would be agreed upon right now, given the current geopolitical situation. So what we want to do is exactly that, go back to the roots of the organization and speak at the highest level, trying to get the attention of ministers on what are the values of this organization. And as somebody who has worked in the field, has worked at the very grassroots in the organization, I worked in the Balkans in the 90s, I have seen with my own eyes the benefits that this organization actually delivers on the ground. I've seen many people who have enjoyed the work of the OSCE missions in institution building, in conflict prevention, in reform of law enforcement, in reform of the judiciary. So this organization does a lot of good work, but nobody knows about it. And so what we need to do is to keep on doing this good work. Probably a lot of it is done in silence, but also call the attention of the ministers. And that's what we try to do with this manifesto. And I think our president will present this manifesto to the ministers at the Ministerial Council meeting on the 3rd of December. And there we will start a series of conversations in the different areas of the OSCE portfolio. And I hope to engage many of you, of course, Spencer Oliver and others in this call to keep on talking about the organization and strengthening the organization. Thank you very much, and sorry for being too long.
That's okay. Thank you, Roberto. I think if you need a partner audience in the United States, we're happy to be part of that conversation. Let me now we only have a couple minutes, really just brief. I want to weave in 3 different questions I've gotten, but they all kind of point in the same direction. It highlights, we talked a lot about the political role of the OSCE, but really some would say that its most important contributions have been in its field missions. That it's not what happens in Vienna, it's what happens out in the conflict areas. And that this role it has played through conflict prevention, monitoring, all of those kinds of things have really been where it's made its biggest difference if you think about all of the issues I tried to raise earlier. But it's challenged now. This special monitoring mission in Ukraine isn't able to fulfill its full mandate. The OSCE, frankly, was sidelined in the Nagorno-Karabakh crisis. Some would say maybe now there's a role for the OSCE going forward now that there's some sort of armistice, if you will, but maybe not. But it wasn't a good day for the OSCE after working on it for decades, and then suddenly Russia and Turkey, frankly, came in and ignored the organization. And then there's a question about the OSCE in Belarus. It was made of an offer to sort of get engaged, but so far it's been limited. So it's very difficult. We only have, and it's even more difficult because we have 3 minutes. So let me turn to anyone on that panel who wants to take this on. The future of the field missions, its relevance in a tough area like Nagorno-Karabakh, where really the credibility of the whole organization is on the line if it's not relevant to exactly the issues it says it's working on. It's not a bashful group usually, but so I'm going to
happy to jump
Alex.
in, Dan.
Alex, go
And
ahead,
then,
Alex,
of course, I would defer to Ambassador Hill, who actually, of course, led a field mission in Moldova.
I'll give you each a minute, 1 minute.
Quickly, I just wanted to say the field missions are where the OSCE matters in our lives. It's where many Europeans see the tangible impact and the connection between the political commitments and the functioning of their institutions. And the important thing is, I hope more Americans also recognize and get engaged, including civil society and other subnational actors, to take a look at how the OSCE can be a platform for addressing a number of issues and securing that high-level political commitment to move forward in a transatlantic manner. The challenge, as you said, how a number of key conflicts were cut out of negotiations where the OSCE was not able to be active, really speaks to the crisis of the abuse of the consensus rule in some instances to block even the continued operation of field operations in, for example, the office in Yerevan that was closed, of course, blocked by Azerbaijan. So there needs to be a refresh and a serious look at how we can ensure that nations that want to have field operations are able to have them, and that there continues to be robust national support and funding for their continued operations.
Thank you. Bill, 1 minute.
I would just add that if a head of mission doesn't have united support from headquarters, from the major states at headquarters, you're not going to get anything done. I mean, I wrote the proposal for the Minsk conference. We were supposed to have a peace conference between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and they signed the document and in 1992, and then never came to the conference, and they ended up at war. You know, these things happen, and it's not just the OSCE, the United Nations. You have to keep trying, and as part of this, you have to put a good mission in the field that can do a lot, and you have to work hard to maintain unity in the headquarters that sends the mission out, so that the head of mission has political support and is able to overcome political resistance, which there will be in the states to which you are accredited. That's a realist view, but the fact that it's difficult and the fact that not all of them work the way we thought they would isn't a reason for not doing them, because you still can do a lot of good.
Okay. Spencer, bring us home. 1 minute. Do you have anything you would add to round up?
Well, I agree with all of the previous speakers here just before me, but I think that there needs to be some attention given to OSCE reform. This is like, sound like a bad record, but there really does need to be some political level attention to reorganizing the institutional structures of the OSCE if you're going to make it work. And it's worth trying to do, because the Charter of Paris and the Helsinki Final Act are documents which are extremely valuable. They've made a great contribution to peace and security throughout the region. And there's no other place where you have 57 countries sitting around the table where everybody's equal. And I think that that's the important ingredient for the OSCE, as Bill said. I mean, there's no other place quite like it. But at some point, They have to rise above the more minor issues like whether or not somebody's going to get a second level job in some institution and holding up the whole budget unless you get it. That's what happens. That's why the OSCE is now in deep trouble, because that has become the main function of a lot of the people in Vienna, is trying to get some advantage for themselves or their colleagues, and that's a mistake. I really don't think we need a permanent council. I would rather go back to the annual review meetings and ministerials where some public attention is brought to bear on the accountability of people who've made commitments under the Helsinki Final Act and the Charter of Paris. You need a Secretary General. You need a Secretariat. The institutions are good. Parliamentary Assembly is a godsend for the organization, and the field missions, as Alex pointed out, are where the real work is done. But at some point, the field missions have got to be acceptable to the host countries. Otherwise, it's not going to work. But they need political level support and political level encouragement to make it work. So I'm hopeful, but we're in a deep ditch. So we got to stop digging and start building.
Okay, good words to end on. It's a sober reflection of the accomplishments and the challenges that we have. I want to thank you all for joining us today. I want to thank our audience for sticking with us and participating. This webcast will be posted on the Wilson Center site, and I hope it receives some additional attention. But thank you all for continuing with us. Alex, thank you, and the Helsinki Commission for co-sponsoring with us today, and my colleagues at the Kennan Institute at the Wilson Center, and everyone else. So thank you again. Hope you have a good day, good weekend. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.